Well, hello, and thank you for joining us today. I am Roy Harriman with Ministry Pacific, and I'm joined by Vaughn Baker, who is president of Strategos International. And our topic today is prevailing in a security crisis. Vaughn, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Roy. Good to be here.
Let me tell you a little bit more about Vaughn. He is president of Strategos International, and he is one of the nation's leading church security experts. But his expertise is not confined to churches. He has trained thousands of people in business, education, ministry, even the military and law enforcement over the last 2 decades. And he is also a man of deep personal faith. So this is more than business to him. So Vaughn, thank you for joining us. So far, we are getting some people joining us from coast to coast. Kenneth in St. Helena, California. Gabrielle, Elk Grove, Donald, Rancho Cordova, Steve from West Virginia. And today's topic is called Prevailing in a Security Crisis. Now, this is different from other webinars that we have conducted on church security in a more general sense. By the way, you can view all of those on our website at ministrypacific.com. But today, we're focusing on a specific method of responding to a violent intrusion. Now, there are several of these methods in circulation, with the most widely known one often referred to as run, hide, fight. Now, Vaughn and his team, based on real-world experience, felt this concept was misleading and could even be fatal. Not that anyone intended to mislead. And as a result, they've formulated an intruder response that they call the 3 outs: lockout, get out, and take out. So, Vaughn, can you bring us in on your thinking process? How does run, hide, fight fall short of the goal of giving people clear guidance in a crisis?
Well, Roy, I first of all want to commend you on the title of this particular webinar because it does really, knowing that words matter and words create a mindset. And when we talk about responding or effectively responding to these issues, the title of your webinar, Prevailing in a Security Crisis, that's much different than what we normally see these sorts of training sessions titled. Normally we see the word survive or surviving the event. And there's a big difference between prevailing and surviving. You can do everything wrong and still survive an event. But prevailing creates the right mindset, and that's a winning mindset. And that means, to me, prevailing means going home with the same amount of holes I came with. So I do want to recognize and take a step back and recognize that those 2 words are very different. As far as the run, hide, fight model, we've been teaching people on this model. We've trained over 275,000 folks in 15 countries on this and a wide variety of safety and security related topics. But the run, hide, fight model came out in 2009 after we had been teaching the 3-out model for a few years. Run, hide, fight was developed by the city of Houston. And of course, it sounds great and it's pretty catchy. But before we teach anybody on any life and death related topic, we always test it first. And, run, hide, fight specifically says it's a linear based model, meaning it tells you specifically, and that's how it was designed, to respond in a linear fashion, meaning you do it in that particular order. You run away from the threat first if you can. And if that doesn't work, you can hide. And if that doesn't work, you can fight. Well, running and hiding is a defensive mindset. It creates a defensive mindset, whereas fighting back is an offensive mindset. And it's very difficult to transition between those two. But before we pass judgment, we actually wanted to test it when it first came out. And we tested that model, that linear-based model, with a wide variety of participants. And we did that with hundreds and hundreds of school participants. And what ended up happening is we told them to run away when they heard the shots. And we found that actually more than half of the participants ran towards the shots. And the reason for that is inside of a building, when all the shots are being fired, you cannot tell where those shots are coming from. So what ends up happening is people think they're running away from the shots and they actually run towards the shots. And you can imagine in a training environment, which is a regional simulation of the real thing, how shocked they were when they rounded the corner and the attacker was right there in this training environment. So when we design curriculum, knowing, especially on this particular topic, we designed it with the idea that, hey, what is it I would want my loved ones to know on how to keep themselves safe prior to law enforcement getting there? Of course, that's something we want to test, because I don't want to set my loved ones up for failure. And of course, we don't want to set our students up for failure either. So that's what we found when we actually tested run, hide, fight. And of course, it created the wrong mindset too. Playing hide and seek with a gunman is not the right mindset. So asking people to run and hide creates a defensive mindset or even victim-like thinking. And then we ask them to transition to fighting back, which is a very tough transition from victim thinking to fighting for your life. And so that's really our thoughts and opinions based on some testing that we did.
So, Vaughn, the experience then that you had in general was that run, hide, fight gives the psychological impression, but also tactically expresses that your goal here is to hang on and hope you survive versus, look, we want to overcome this and go home and see our loved ones tonight.
Yeah, and the word you use there is hope. And what we know is hope is not a strategy. And we need to be focused on strategies, not. And of course, another definition I heard about hope was, hope is the feeling you have that the feeling you have isn't permanent. So that's really what hope is. And although from a spiritual point of view, our hope in Jesus Christ is something that is a promise that we can count on. When we're talking about this sort of thing, strategies need to be based on things that are tested. And of course, spiritually speaking, those are tested as well. So when we talk about hoping for the best, that's not a strategy. It needs to be combined with something that's been tested.
Let's talk about again, run, hide, and fight versus the 3 outs: get out, lock out, take out, or you can say it in any order that you'd like. The issue that seems the most problematic, as I've listened to your training over the years, is the issue of hide. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, and what's the difference between hiding and locking out?
Well, hiding, again, we talk about this idea of hiding, playing hide and seek with a gunman. Well, the penalty when you're playing hide and seek, the game, is you get caught and tagged, you're it. Well, the penalty in this sort of crisis is life and death. So what we're talking about here, and of course, many times when the run, hide, fight is taught, they're saying, well, run really doesn't mean run. Hide really doesn't mean hide. It really means this. Well, that's an important distinction. Why not just say what you really mean versus having to interpret what you're thinking, what that person means when they're saying that. The big difference between hiding and locking out is I'm preventing access for the attacker to get to my particular location, and rather than hoping he doesn't find me. So we're participating in our own outcome, in other words. And that means we're going to prevent access by locking a door. If the door doesn't have a lock, we're going to use lots of different strategies that we teach. We're actually going to share a video with you. I know you're going to share with the participants here. We're going to show you some very simple strategies where you can prevent access from the attacker to getting into the location where you find yourself, whether that's a room or an area. So that's the biggest difference, is preventing access versus hoping they don't find you.
As Vaughn referenced, we're going to include a 7-minute training that Vaughn shares on this concept of lockout, get out, take out. And one of the things it specifically focuses on is how to secure a room. It's something you don't think about unless you're faced with the prospect of someone terrorizing your building, and that's not the time to learn.
Okay, I want to take just a couple minutes here and show you how to do a 3-out assessment no matter where you find yourself. Now, we find ourselves here in a meeting room, and the first thing we got to ask ourselves is which out is appropriate. Now, remember how we figure that out. The out is appropriate of the 3 outs: lockout, get out, take out, will be determined on 1, your proximity in relation to the threat, and 2, the environment that you find yourself in relation to the threat. Now, in this particular environment here, we are in a room that has a door on it. So the first question we got to ask ourselves is, as we look around the room here, is this an open in or an open out door? Well, as you can see here, this is an open in door. It opens into the room. So Following this, we're going to show you 2 or 3 techniques for locking out a door, whether it has a lock on it or not, for locking it out using gross motor skills for open indoors. After that, we'll show you techniques for open outdoors. Okay, we've determined this is a room that has an open indoor. The door opens into the room. So the techniques we're going to show you here are techniques that are very fast, and it will allow you to reinforce your lockdown. Remember, never be satisfied with a locked door alone. So we're going to create redundancy to our lockdown. And even though we may have a door with a lock on it, but we're going to create redundancy by, in this case, we're going to be doing what we call human bridging. Now, human bridging is a very fast technique. You can do it with one person or more than one person, but we would recommend more than one person if you can, because it's a much stronger technique, but it is very effective with one person. So remember, when we become aware of the threat, we're going to pick the lockout of the 3 outs. We're going to close and lock the door. After we close and lock the door, we're going to turn the lights off. That will create the ability to limit the attacker from seeing into the door. Now, for human bridging, what we're going to do is I'm going to place my hand half on the door frame and half on the door itself. The other thing is I'm going to put my right foot, in this case, half on the door frame, and you see that my foot down at the bottom is pinning the door. Now, when it pins the door, and then I'm going to place one hand over the other, I'm going to lock it, and I'm going to lean into it, and I'm going to lock my arms. Now, the reason I lock my arms is because I'm much stronger when my arms are locked versus when they're bent. So we're going to lock our arms out, and now, using the carpet to reinforce myself, I've become a very strong brace, and if somebody tries to open the door, it's very difficult to do that, and I've created redundancy to my lockdown. Now, you also see in this case here, we've got a viewing window next to the door, but it is frosted. That, in combination with the lights being turned off, will prevent the attacker from seeing in. Now remember, most people make decisions on what they can see. So if we prevent somebody from seeing into the room, we can prevent them from making a decision whether they're going to try to enter that room as well. Okay, what I've just showed you is the one-person bridging. Now what we're going to do is we're going to bring in a second person to reinforce. No different with this second person. They're going to put their arms, lock them out, and they're going to do it between my shoulder blades and then place their foot next to my back foot and reinforce me on that back side. So again, I'm going to put my hand on there, foot, pin the door, one hand over the other. I'm going to lean into it. My second person comes in, is really pushing into my shoulder blades. Their foot goes next to my foot. And again, straight arms for that person as well. And now we've created a 2-person bridge, which is very difficult to defeat. Okay, the next technique we're going to show you for open indoors, doors that open into the room, is mechanical bridging. Now, bridging, remember the thought behind bridging is what we want to do is we want to get the door closed and locked. We're also going to turn off the lights. And then what we're trying to do is we're trying to take up and build a bridge between this door that opens into the room and an opposite fixed object, in this case the wall. So what we're going to do with mechanical bridging, we just happen to have some furniture here. We're going to move this over to the door quickly. This is a pretty fast technique. And then you notice we still have some room here, this space that we need to take up. We're trying to build a bridge to prevent this door from opening into the room. We have a chair here that's in this conference room as well. What we're going to do is we're going to jam it in between, and now we've taken up that space, and if they try to open this door, it's going to be very difficult to do so. They've got to put a hole in this wall in order to do so. Okay, the next techniques we're going to focus on are those for doors that open out. What I mean by that is doors that open out of the room you're in. Now we're actually in a hallway here because we don't have any doors that open out in this particular building. But what we're going to do is demonstrate, we're using this door. We're going to pretend like we're in a room right now, and this door that opens out of the room into the hallway right there. So first of all, we want to focus, don't forget, we want to focus on techniques that are fastest to the slowest. We want to create redundancy to our locked door, if we have a locked door, by focusing on those techniques that are fastest. One of the fastest techniques is to use a straight object like a chair leg or a broom handle or a mop handle to prevent this door from opening out. So what I'm going to use here is I do happen to have a mop handy. So I'm going to use the end of this door handle, and I'm going to stuff this mop handle into the L-shaped door handle, and I'm going to brace it up against the door. Now what I'll do there is it prevents this door, and I'm going to get back as far as I can so I'm not in the glass viewing area, and it braces it up against the door and prevent that handle from moving down, and also braces it up against this door frame to prevent the door from opening. Okay, the next technique I'm going to show you for doors that open out of the room that you're in is the human belay technique. Now, what I have here is I have a rope. This is called 550 cord. You can buy this at Walmart or at Lowe's for just a few dollars. 15-foot section is what you'll need. 550 means it takes 550 pounds to break it. Now, but you can also use network cable, network cord. You can use extension cord that you find in your work area. All these will work. What I've done here is I've created a little loop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to feed the rope back through itself, through that loop, and create a slip knot. That slip knot will then go over the door, and we can pull that tight. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the rope back against the door frame out of the viewing window. Now in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this rope as close as I can to the wall, and then I'm going to wrap the rope around my body. Now the reason we do this versus wrapping it around our hands is if wrapping it around our hands, now we're relying on grip strength, we're relying on arm strength. But by wrapping around my body, around my butt area, I'm then going to wrap the rope around itself a couple times, and then I'm going to lean back into it. And when I lean back into it, rather than being strong in my hands and my arms, all I've got to use is my body weight. Now I've got lots and lots of weight that I can use to hold that. If you look up there by the door frame, you'll see that friction point that we've created with this rope attached to the door handle, and I'm exponentially stronger than just the weight I'm using because now the rope has to come around that friction point. So this is a secondary redundancy to my lockdown besides locking the door, and we call this the human belay.
A lot of excellent tools are at your disposal, more than you think. Tom from Sacramento, thank you for joining us. Also, Tom from Stockton, Raquel from Los Angeles. Another Tom. Toms are dominating this webinar today from Elk Grove. So we appreciate you joining us. Vaughn, the idea between one thing that run, hide, fight, at least on paper, has going for it is the simplicity of remembering that. And with lockout, get out, take out, it also is it's similarly a concise thing to remember, and you don't have to remember it in any certain order. As you're training people, what's the value of having some very succinct phrase to help you to remember what to do when you're under duress?
Well, those things that are complex to deploy in a crisis are not going to be very effective. In other words, when emotions are high, logic is low. So we got to keep these solutions and these models very simple. So if it has more than 3 steps, it's going to be difficult to remember in crisis. So we try to keep it to no more than 3. Now, the difference between run, hide, fight, and 3 out, one of the differences is the 3 out model is a non-linear model, meaning any out that you use, any of these particular outs, lockout, get out, take out, could be your first out, depending on one of 2 things. The first is your location in relation to the threat. And the second is where do you find yourself? What environment do you find yourself at the time you perceive the threat? That's what's going to determine which of these outs is appropriate. So it's a non-linear approach versus a linear approach that run, hide, fight was how that model was developed and designed. So that's the first thing. So we got to keep it easy. One of the things you referenced as well is the techniques within that model need to be simple to deploy using gross motor skills. In a crisis, your fine motor skills are going to go away. In other words, that key that worked yesterday isn't going to work today because your hands are shaking. About 120 beats per minute, your heart beating, your fine motor skills are going to start to degrade or go away. So we got to keep our techniques gross motor skill based if we can. There's some that maybe are a little bit more fine motor skill, but with a little bit of practice and training, we can use those techniques as well. So that's one of the biggest distinctions on when we do pick a model, which ones we're going to pick.
Right. Yeah. Under duress, we might have a hard time remembering our middle name, but 3 outs, especially lockout, get out, take out, especially if you go through the training and you hear that phrase often enough, and then you see it demonstrated, which is what you do in your training, you can be much more likely to put it into practice or to have someone idea what to do when your adrenaline is surging and there's an imminent threat to you, or at a church, it could be children, it could be parishioners. Let's also talk about get out, lockout, get out, take out. And the danger of something that's simple to remember is that we oversimplify its application. And I know that's what training is for. It's where you expand and give context. But when you talk about get out, there is some context there that needs to be explained. So you don't mean obviously like jumping out of a 10-story window, right? So tell us a little bit about get out, and how do you get out? Where do you get out? When do you know it's safe to get out of the situation?
Well, jumping out of the 10-story building is one option, but it's probably not the right option.
Yeah.
It will allow you to get away from the threat, but shortly thereafter, you're going to have another crisis you're going to have to deal with. And that crisis is called gravity. But really what we're talking about there is getting out, is getting away from the, and in many cases, if you're on a second or third or fourth floor or higher, you may be talking about getting out of the area. And we actually, when we find ourselves in these areas, we call them get out areas. And examples of get out areas might be a sanctuary. Very difficult to lock down a sanctuary unless you have some technology to lock all doors very quickly. But you might get out of that area to a room that you can lock out. Cafeterias are another areas that are get out areas. Big open areas, gymnasiums are get out areas. But you're going to get out of those areas to areas that you can lock out. Now, if you happen to be right on a ground floor next to an exit door, we can get out of the building altogether. It's important we have that distinction on, okay, we're going to get out, but what are we getting out of? Are we getting out of the building itself, or are we just getting out of the area to an area where we can use another out, which is the lockout, and get to a room that we can lock out and prevent access for that attacker to get to those areas as well.
The question that you have to think through ahead of time is, if I get out of this room, am I heading into an area of greater risk or an area of lesser risk? And so I assume then I'd have to consider, if I can secure this room, is that a lesser risk than fleeing the room?
Well, the example I can think of there, you're on a third floor and you decide you're going to try to get out of the building. Well, then you got to get on the elevator, or you got to go down for 3 different hallways. And then when the elevator door opens, what are you going to be faced with? Is the attacker going to be right there? And then you got to go down a couple other hallways before you can get out of the building. Well, that's a dangerous journey that you're talking about there, where maybe your risk is going to be much less if you just get out of the area you're at on the 3rd floor to a room that you can lock out to prevent access from the attacker getting into that area.
And I believe I've heard you share that another consideration is there an attacker, or is the attacker outside? So like getting to the parking lot might not be what you need at that point.
Exactly. And you may have another threat in the parking lot, or on the journey to the parking lot, you end up coming across the attacker because you've had to expose yourself down a lot of open areas in order to make that journey.
Lockout and get out. And the third option of the 3 outs is takeout. And this would be, to use the comparison, the fight in run, hide, and fight. Tell us about takeout, and what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean that you put on your Chuck Norris suit, right? Tell us what that can mean for the normal person who's not ex-military or law enforcement or trained in the martial arts.
Well, yeah, and when we talk about taking out, I want to really understand that taking out is the right to defend yourself, and we say it is a last resort, but it could be your first and only option, because now the attacker is in your area. You're in a confined area. You have no opportunity for escape. The only thing you can do where you're going to increase your chances of prevailing is to fight back. Now, we have seen statistically, we've seen many of these events ended by unarmed people that chose to fight for their life. And especially if there's 1, 2, or 3 people or more that choose to fight back when they had no other choice, that is a formidable force. And I want you to understand it from the attacker's point of view. And remember, he picked that location, and his psychology is he picked that location because he perceived people would not fight back. So it is going to be a surprise to him when you choose to fight back, especially you or 2 or 3 others that are doing it at the same time. He enters the room and all of a sudden he's presented with a fight. Now his chances of prevailing or significantly decreases. Now, the other alternative to that is simply hiding underneath a desk and begging for your life. Well, now your ability to live through that event is going to be determined by the attacker. It's not going to be determined by you. And you're hoping he's going to let you live. And begging for your life, by the way, is going to feed the frenzy. You're not all of a sudden going to receive empathy or sympathy from the attacker. Why? Because remember, he's transitioning from victim to victimizer. That's the nature of the act for this particular person. The traditional attacker, their worldview is victim victimizer. They perceive themselves as a victim of society their whole life. Now they're going to victimize others. Instead of being the victim, they want to transition to the victimizer. Well, that's not easy to do because they've behaviorally been preconditioned to be a victim their whole life. So the only way they can do that successfully is if we let them, and because they've not behaviorally preconditioned to be a victimizer. So that's why they pick locations where they perceive people won't fight back. That's also why we don't see these people committing these acts at police stations, because they know they're going to have a fight. So we've seen statistically, many of these events have been stopped by people that chose to participate in their own outcome, and they fought back or they employed the takeout approach.
And I like the way you say that, choose to participate in my own outcome. And you're talking about responding from a point of training and confidence, not some rash, act that's completely unconsidered. Vaughn, when you talk about takeout, you have essentially an inventory of improvised weapons of offense or defense that aren't truly weapons. At least that wasn't what you thought when you went to Staples and bought the office supplies. What are some elements or actual physical items that people can employ in holding back an intruder from causing harm to themselves or others?
Well, yeah, we have few things we can employ now. Two things. If you have an opportunity to pick the right item to fight back with, I think about those items that can deliver force. Now, when you think about back to your physics class, the formula for force was mass times velocity. Mass times velocity equals force. Now, if you don't have time to pick the right item that will give you the best opportunity to deliver force on the attacker, any item flying through the air towards the attacker, he's not going to have time to determine, hey, when that gets here, is that going to hurt when it hits me? No, he's going to duck and flinch, and he's going to be distracted, which may give you an opportunity to close distance on that attacker. But if you can pick the right item that has the ability to deliver force, I think about a broom handle. I think about those things that surround you right now, the books that are on the bookcase, staplers, 3-hole punches, letter openers, scissors, all those things that may be readily available that we can fight back with, that we can deliver force. Those items that we can strike with, those items that we can slash with or stab with. These aren't things that we like to think about, but when we're talking about fighting for our own life or the lives of people we care about, we ask people in our training, we say, hey, raise your hand if there's somebody in your life worth living for. Well, that's what your motivation should be to fight back with. And that's the mindset we want you to have when you are choosing to fight back with. So those are just a few items that I think about that we can use that are in our everyday environments.
I know one of your trainings that I've observed, someone pointed out the fire extinguisher is something that, a heavy object that can generates a lot of force.
Yeah, that creates blunt force, but even the contents of a fire extinguisher, the small 5-10 pound fire extinguishers, that little talcum powder like substance inside that fire extinguisher, we spray that in somebody's face. You and I, including bad guys, we make decisions primarily off of which of our 5 senses? Well, it's sight. About 80% of the information that we gather to make a decision comes from sight, which is our most dominant primary sense. So if we can affect that person's sight by spraying that talcum powder-like substance in their eyes, I just ask you and your audience to think about, even when you've had a small speck of dust in your eye, how much that affected your vision and your ability to make decisions quickly. The same thing's true for the attacker. So a 5-pound fire extinguisher you can get at Lowe's for $17 is a great tool that we can fight back with. Keep it in your work area. And what do you know? Now you're very fire preventative as well. If there is fire, we got a tool for that as well.
What I like about this approach, again, is that you're making it available to the every man and every woman. And, things that we don't think about. If one of your employees was to pick up a textbook and throw it at your head, you would not be pleased, right? I mean, I imagine they probably would be terminated, unless that's just a game that you guys play around the office to keep each other sharp. I'm guessing it's not.
No, yeah, those would be probably one-time events if you were doing that as a joke.
Right. But so a library, textbooks, and there's a lot of things just within our range in an office or educational environment that again, that can deter people. And as you mentioned, just even though it might not injure someone, just getting them off balance. A friend of mine who was in the Marine Corps, he shared with me, he was in a convenience store when there was some sort of a robbery, and he was throwing like donuts at an attacker that knocked him off of his poise, and obviously not going to be injured by something like that. But as you say, we don't get redos or second chances in events like this, so we have to take advantage of what's in front of us.
Well, and I personally, with my law enforcement background, I can tell you donuts would be a big distraction for me.
Well, we'll try to keep that in mind. Well, I have a related vignette here to share, and then we'll get back with some more questions from Vaughn and your questions and comments. But I wanted to share about 2 insurance options that complement church security, and then we'll hear more from Vaughn. So the first is called active shooter insurance. And the role of active shooter insurance is, if there is a violent incident at your church, it doesn't literally have to be a shooting. Your church can be sued for negligence by the people who were harmed. So active shooter insurance provides for a legal defense. So in the United States, it is not difficult to be sued, but it is expensive to defend yourself, even if you win. So even if you win, you lose because of the hourly rate times however many hours that you're paying out to attorneys to protect you. So the active shooter insurance provides for a legal defense in the event that someone is seeking to sue you for negligence for their injury or a death. Now, there are caveats to active shooter insurance, and these are related to that your church your church or nonprofit at least has to try to have some sort of security plan. So if a church or nonprofit has done nothing to try to create a secure environment, it's unlikely that an insurer is going to step in to provide coverage. So active shooter insurance protects organizations who do their best to prevent violence. Something happens and they get sued anyway. And a related coverage is called catastrophic insurance, and it helps fund counseling and other services related to recovering from a traumatic event. And these things aren't part of standard liability insurance, which most of you hopefully have. So we encourage you, if you just want to learn more about it, contact us at Ministry Pacific, and we can explain how you could possibly benefit from that. Vaughn, when we were talking earlier, I mentioned the danger of oversimplifying. And so although the 3 outs are easy to remember, the way to apply them isn't necessarily intuitive. What role can security training or specifically training that you provide help churches and nonprofits or other organizations to be able to implement this concept?
Well, yeah, the training is a key to it. And even though it is a simple model, there is a training component. You can't expect success in a crisis unless you have trained in advance. Now, part of that is prayer, of course, but you increase your chances of, one of the questions that we get frequently from those in the faith-based community is, well, yeah, if you're preparing, then you're showing a lack of faith. Well, the Bible is very clear about, especially in James, talks about faith without works is dead, and the works piece is the training component. Yeah, prayer is a piece of the puzzle, but prayer needs to be accompanied with preparation. And so it's not one or the other, it's both. And so we talk about that now. The 3-out model, this non-linear model, it is important that whatever model you pick, that it's a non-linear approach, that we're not doing, you do this step first and you do this step second, you do the other step third. It's any of these outs will be appropriate based on your location in relation to the threat and what environment you find yourself in at the time you perceive the threat. So that's really how we determine which of these outs is going to be appropriate. In other words, my out may not necessarily be your out, even in the same room. If it's a large room, we may have 2 different outs happening based on your location in relation to the threat. I may be next to an exit door. I'm going to get out. You happen to draw the short straw, and you happen to be next to the door that the attacker came in. Well, your best out's going to be takeout. So that's where we talk about training coming in, and of course, not only talking about it, but actually having an opportunity to practice it. In our hands-on training, we do allow people to have the opportunity to practice the techniques, as well as we do some short simulations, where 3.5-minute scenarios where they get a chance to practice what they've learned as well.
So this is getting into some of the psychology of education, but particularly with a challenging topic like this, how important is it to role play, or I think the phrase you used was simulation, versus sitting in a class?
Well, role play is where we're building what we call our tactical Rolodex up here in our mind. And again, what we do there is we're building solutions for different types of crisis through training, whether that's severe weather, whether that's the active armed intruder. But we would rather write those Rolodex cards of solutions in training. So now the solution that we've tested and we've learned in training is tucked away on our little Rolodex. And when the crisis occurs, God forbid if it does, we go retrieve that card and we implement the solution. But what we don't want to be in the position of when we don't train, and we haven't had training on that particular topic, is trying to write our Rolodex card in the moment. And 1, that's not going to be very accurate. And 2, we're not going to be very fast in writing our Rolodex card. I'd much rather deploy what I've learned in training versus having to figure it out in the moment, which probably isn't going to give me a good result.
Yes, I believe there's a statement attributed to some ancient Greek person whose name I would mispronounce even if I could remember it. But I believe it's better to sweat in training than to bleed in battle. It sounds like that's really what you're saying. Exactly.
And you will default to the training, the lowest amount of training that you've had in the crisis. And if you haven't had any training, then hope is going to be your only option. Hope and prayer is going to be your option, because you don't know what to do. And that's many times where fear on this topic comes from. Many times people don't want to train because they're worried they're going to increase fear with people that they train, when the opposite is in fact true. Fear is decreased because we have trained our people. Fear comes from having a problem without a solution. That's where fear comes from. So once we get people a solution to their problem, we actually decrease fear, not increase it.
Another quote related to that is that to what you just said, is we don't rise up to a level of greatness, we rise up to the level of our training. Mm-hmm. And so if we have no training, we have nothing but anxiety to respond to. Vaughn, so lockout, get out, take out. And I hope everybody who watches today, either live with us or on the internet later on, will remember at least lockout, get out, take out. And you can say that in any order that you wish, and it could still be applicable. As Vaughn said, it's non-linear. Those essentially, those will be helpful no matter what dilemma you're in. But how do those fit into the larger picture of a church security ministry?
Well, the 3-out model is what we teach our volunteers, what we teach our staff members, but there's a whole level of other preparedness as well as training that, if for our safety and security team, for our leadership team, on lots of different types of threats that we could face, whether those are natural weather-related threats or whether they're man-made threats. So this is just a small piece of the puzzle. I did notice one of our chat questions here. Somebody's asking about preparedness measures, and I'll just read the question here. It says they've limited access to their kids' ministry building to one entrance, with plans to close that entrance 15 minutes after the start of the service. Then parents have to access via door buzzer closed circuit camera. And the concern that is expressed in this question is, how do you balance ministry and security? Because are we limiting ministry by having to do security? And it is a balance. And one of the other balance that takes place that we talk about there is balancing convenience versus security, because you can't have both. It is constantly balancing that. We really believe that if you do security properly within your church should become a more friendly place, not a less friendly place. We're not trying to turn it into a prison. And one of the things in our leadership course that we talk about is constantly filtering these decisions we make security related through the core mission of ministry. And in other words, the core mission we define as to provide an atmosphere of comfort, refuge, worship, learning, and sharing the gospel. Once we define that core mission, now our decision safety and security wise become filtered through the core mission. Is the decision we're going to make safety and security wise going to compromise the core mission? If it is, then we got to come up with a better answer. Now, when it comes to the kids ministry, most parents don't mind inconvenience, and they don't mind these sorts of procedures on behalf of the safety of their kids. They see that church is taking the safety of their kids very seriously, so they don't mind that. So, that's a great question, James, that you asked in the chat today.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I do want to recommend Strategos, not only for anything related to church security, but also for evaluating safety measures in children's ministry. I've been at one of their on-site trainings where they walked through the children's area and they talked about each component of the facility, the check-in desk, and how it related to security and their ability. I've seen this actually several times. And so their ability to analyze buildings and personnel, volunteer placement, and how that affects the flow of people in and out and security measures. They really have a gift at evaluating facilities and helping you to protect, do the maximum to protect children. Just put this out here for your consideration, Vaughn. Just in terms of related to this question, balancing ministry and safety, is there are several ways essentially for the face of your security ministry to appear. One would be the layperson doesn't know that there's a security ministry simply because they do such a great job of blending in over to where you have uniformed police on duty. Can you tell us a little bit about the options there and why you would choose one over another?
Yeah, that's part of your goals and objectives for putting together your safety and security ministry, is identifying how we want to set that up. Do we want a uniformed presence, or do we want non-uniformed, or a combination of both? There's pros and cons to each of those things. Are we wanting armed response capability on site with our safety and security ministry, or we want unarmed? If we want armed, well, a significant amount of training needs to be invested into those folks to make sure that they have the requisite amount. That's a huge responsibility. So we got to make sure that those folks are highly trained and they're vetted and background checked as well. So lots of things to think about when we talk about safety and security. Safety and security is a journey. It's not a destination. It's a never-ending journey that we need to think about. Also got to make sure that safety and security isn't the catch-all, end-all, that all decisions need to be filtered through safety and security. Remember, it's a support function. It's not the ministry itself. Sharing the gospel and doing it and serving those that have needs with hurts, heartaches, and hangups is what our ministry is there for. So safety and security needs to be subservient to the core mission.
That's excellent. And that's why what you just heard is why we specifically have Vaughn Baker and Strategos International sharing insights with our clients and friends here, because the principles that you would apply at a concert or throwing people out of a bar are not it's a completely different mindset. And as Vaughn goes to a church, he serves in security at a church, and he understands the mission of the church. And again, is that there is a goal, and security is a part of the ministry, but it's not the end all be all. Well, Vaughn, for next step, someone's watching either live here now or after the fact. What are their options in terms of connecting with Strategos? Can they schedule a consultation? Can they just call to learn more, or can they actually get a local training on the books or a video training? What are their options to learn more?
Sure. They can attend an existing scheduled course. They can host a course at their church for their region, for churches to attend at their church. If they want to go to our website that you see shown here, you can go to Services tab and then look under Church Solutions, and you'll be able to see all the services, whether they're consultant, training, or protection services that we offer churches. We're happy to serve you in a wide variety of methods, depending on what your particular needs are, whether you're starting from scratch or whether you're wanting to professionalize or formalize an informal safety and security ministry effort. We can come alongside you and work with you in a wide variety of areas.
Excellent. So it sounds like you can begin saying, listen, I don't know what I don't know. Help me, guide me, point me in the right direction, to look, I know exactly what we need. We need this training, and you can accommodate those extremes and anything in between.
Absolutely.
This is a great question from Kenneth. It says, what are preferred messaging strategies when communicating with church members so they don't panic or misunderstand why the church wants to form a safety and security ministry? Excellent question.
Yeah, and sometimes we get the question, should you tell people you have a safety and security ministry? Yes, I would recommend telling them. Now, how you tell them and when you tell them is important. You're not going to give them all the specifics of what you're doing, but many churches choose to message it on maybe a Sunday evening or Wednesday evening, because that's when your folks that are maybe the more regular attenders will attend. You can let people know that, hey, our church does have a plan for safety and security type of events, whether that's dealing with everything from a slip, trip, or a fall, all the way up to an armed intruder. We do have plans. We want you to know we have people that have been highly trained in place to deal with these sorts of events. And if one of these events takes place, we want you to be looking at a member of leadership for direction. But whether that's a protester that shows up on a Sunday morning, we have plans in place. So communicating that to them, so one, they don't misunderstand what the purpose is, and letting them know that your church is going to keep ministry as the first and foremost thing, and that safety and security, worshiping faithfully in uncertain times is the goal, but we're not going to compromise the core mission of what we do to accomplish that goal.
Excellent question. Yeah, being informed is indeed provides an advantage, and I will just say for pastors and ministers, having a security plan that's active and a team that's active, it can save you so much energy. So, for example, the church that I'm a member of, we're having a trunk or treat. Many of you probably are also having a trunk or treat, and there's going to be hundreds of people at that event. If I don't have any kind of security presence there, then I'm going to feel responsible for security, and I'm going to be looking out, who's that guy? I don't know who that is. But if I know that there are competent, trained people invested with security, not only at the trunk or treat, but on Sunday morning, then I'm freed. Not that I want to be blissfully ignorant, but I'm free to focus on the thing that I'm there to do, whether it's serving kids, helping an elderly population, even showing hospitality.
Absolutely. And making sure when we put our culture or our ministry together, that we instill a culture that safety and security is everyone's responsibility, not just those guys. We don't want to have a siloed team of guys that's just their job, that everybody within, whether they're volunteers, whether they're staff, whether they're lay leaders, that it's everyone's responsibility of safety and security.
Well, I want to thank everyone who has spent the time to join us today, and I want to express genuine appreciation for your willingness to be invested in something. I know that no one watching today has a shortage of responsibilities, and so you're going the extra mile to take care of your flock, your constituents, whether you're a church or a nonprofit. And I want to thank you again, Vaughn, for sharing your insights with us.
Absolutely. Honored to be here, and hope everybody found that the time they spent here are useful. I hope everything they learned was a complete waste of time and it's never needed.
That's right. Until the kingdom comes, we have to be ready. And so for now, we're still in the mode of readiness. My last comment is, our hope is that these conversations are not the end of the discussion for you, but they're just the beginning. As Vaughn said, security is a journey. You'll never be able to say, oh, we've got security covered. We're always learning and growing and evolving in security, just like every other aspect of the work that we do in ministry and nonprofit service. So I encourage you, and I'll close with our contact information one last time. Get in touch with Vaughn and Strategos about security-related ministry, security-related services, whether it's a consultation or scheduling a training or something else. And then talk to Ministry Pacific about active shooter insurance, catastrophic insurance, or any other property or liability concern that you might have. So I want to thank you, everybody, for joining us. And if we didn't get to a question you have today, please follow up with us and let us know how we can serve you. And Vaughn, thanks again.
Thank you.